Watercolor Basics. So I recommended a nice little set like this. And this is just a watercolor pan. It's a travel pack. Very nice, very simple. It does have 12 colors. So you'll notice that we have 2 yellows, 2 reds, 2 blues, 2 greens, a few earth tones, and a black. Now, it may be somewhat the same or a little bit different. This one happens to be the Winsor & Newton, and they're really amazing. So one thing that I usually do is I'll grab I have a little a fine mist water sprayer, just with water, and give it a little bit of a wake up spray to activate our watercolors. And there you could see how they're nice and glossy and runny. And how much water you apply, it depends on obviously lots of conditions. If you're outdoor, they're going to dry faster, so you'll be adding a little more water. Or you could just do this with your brush. So I recommended these travel brushes. And obviously you see how they contain their own water, and you could just gently squeeze, and you'll see the water just drop as you squeeze. So it generates its own moisture. So you could just really apply, rub, and then paint directly. Now, if you don't have one of these and you have your regular watercolor brush, here I want to show you. We have flat brush, round brush, synthetic brushes, all different types of natural hairs, and you name it. I'm not going to go into specifics in terms of that, but we will touch on a few different things with different brushes. So the first thing I want to do is just general concepts. What are watercolors? They're exactly like every other paint. They're pigments. The only thing is they have different vehicles. So this is a water soluble. It's based on gum arabic, which is just a resin from a tree that then gets mixed with the pigment, and now you can just add water and paint. It's translucent. It can create glazes, and it is really fast and efficient. But they call this the master's medium because it is one of the hardest mediums to master, to control. And the way I put it always is water will do what water does. So the battle is between you and water and the conditions of your paper. And sometimes, believe it or not, I have a fan running right now. So all these weather conditions, and how you manage that. So we're going to get started with a quick exercise. And for that, I'm going to show you this. So it's a chart, and I just selected one color. In this case, it was alizarin crimson. And what I did is just created a grid. So what I do for something like this is generally I'll take a little bit of masking tape if you have it. And if you don't, you should get some. And they come in different sizes. So some are a little bit thicker, all the way to painters, which is 1/2 inch to 1 inch, or even thicker. For this size, you don't want to go too thick. You'll be covering a lot of paper. So something like this, which is 1/2 inch, will work perfectly. So if you do have it, we'll begin to create a grid. And this is where I'm going to be working on. And what we're going to do is we're going to play with, I think, the fundamental, the most important thing you need to learn about watercolors, and that is watercolor consistency. So I'm working on a sketchbook, but any type of watercolor paper is fine for you to work on. So I'm going to leave this here so you kind of have a sense, and we're going to do something very similar to this page, but it's not going to be exactly like it. We're going to do this side, the consistency of it, and we're going to do it twice. So if you want to go ahead and create a grid, and I suggested maybe if you have a ruler and you like to work orderly, you could just grab a pencil or a pen. If you do grab a pen, make sure it's permanent ink. So maybe a pencil is better. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to split it in half. So I could take my paper, I could split it in half, and then what I want to do is make sure I have 5 rectangles or squares. Matter of fact, you could just make them circles if you want. But I do like to make this a practice in consistency and at the same time, a practice in brush skills. So if you create a couple of squares, and I'm going to take a quick measurement here. So this is 12 inches. If I leave an inch in between, it's about 2 inches each. So I could do that. You could just freehand it if you wish. So you could just go 1, 2. Now, as I mentioned, I would generally do this with nice masking tape, so in the end it looks like this. And if you do that, I generally recommend to do these exercises on a sketchbook, a watercolor sketchbook, so you have them as reference, because it is probably the best way through the years for you to look back and be able to see where you've been, where you've gone, and how much you can improve or revisit some of these exercises. So no matter your level, whether you're beginner, advanced, first time ever you're doing watercolor, or you've been doing it for 20 years, this exercise is one of the best practices to check if you're cutting corners, missing a few steps, or where you need to improve, really. Okay, so we have 5. I'm going to go ahead and do it on the other side as well. And just set them up so we can get to painting. Now, one of the main ingredients for watercolor is having a little bit of patience, as we will see in a few minutes. So that whatever time you take to set this up, whatever time you need, make it patient. There's no rush. We want to make this fun. It's not a race. But if I am working a little too slow for you, then a little bit of patience. And there we have it. So what am I going to do? And I'm going to go ahead and move this just a little over to this side here. So I have my watercolor sets. I have my brush. And for the first exercise, I mentioned I have a flat brush, and it's just a nice straight edge in different sizes that will give me just a nice even flow for something like this. Or I have a round brush, and this is natural hair. The difference is flat and synthetic. This one is round and natural hair. Now, what is the difference with synthetic and natural hair? It actually manages how much water load is on the brush. So if I dip this into water, it's going to carry a lot more, and it's going to run for longer on the paper with water than this one will, because it is the way water holds in these fibers and these bristles, which is the difference with some fancier natural hairs. It actually, the explanation of it is incredible. There's little like scales that run against the grain in the hair, so it holds the water. And you could actually do a quick test on how that works, and it's dipping your brush into your water, and you see how many times, if I were to squeeze it, how many drops do I get out of this? So I begin to squeeze, and you see that you'll get somewhere between 6 and 7 drops of water from just one dip. The difference with this one, sometimes not even 1 or 2. And this one is bigger, by the way. So bigger brushes hold more water, smaller brushes a little bit less. But the difference between the type of bristle, the type of hair, also matters. So I'm going to be using this flat brush, synthetic, for the first exercise. And the next thing is you're going to pick a color, your favorite color, really. I would suggest going with something a little darker, maybe yellow, if your favorite color is yellow. Maybe with the warmer yellow, the more opaque yellow. Notice here I used red. Today I think I'm going to use blue. So we have 2 blues here, a cool and a warm. And for this exercise, I think I'm going to go with the warm. So it's ultramarine blue. Now, what am I trying to do here? What I'm trying to do is grab some pigment. As you can see here, I'm just adding a little bit of water, rubbing my pan, and bringing it over here to my palette. Now, this right now is going nowhere. So even though it's wet, it's really, really thick. So the words that I'm going to use here should serve you, should help you. Think about this as the consistency of the amount of water we're going to add to this. So for the first rectangle, the first square that I just painted here, I want to paint as thick as possible. So the ratio of paint to water is going to be, not exactly, I'm just saying a number, 90% pigment, 10% water. So the consistency would be called something like butter. And that's what I call it. Think about butter or just melting butter. And I'm going to apply it on the first square. And this time I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to go from darkest to lightest, as you can see here. So I'm adding just a little more. So I have enough. So by touching just a tiny bit of water into it and really rubbing that pigment, loading it into my palette, making sure I have it ready. And one thing I want to show you is when I lift this vertically, notice that it just stays there. It's not dripping, it's not runny, because the level of consistency is really thick. So butter, here it goes. Wet on dry, meaning I'm bringing a wet brush on dry paper. Now, one of the biggest tips I want to give you too is pace. Notice that when I lay my brush down and I run it across the paper, I'm measuring my speed. It's not too fast, too slow, but I want to make sure I gauge the level of moisture that is on this mixture of water and pigment. So I don't just leave it streaky. Oop, I'm going to need a little bit more. And notice how this flat brush worked perfectly to just come right to the edge. And I did something I shouldn't have done, which is run it over across again, leaving a little bit of a streak here. So two things. The speed, the pace at which I'm applying, and also the pressure. We never think about this, but it is actually really important for you to, are you really squeezing that brush and pushing it down on the paper? Or are you holding it really just gently, lightly, or even all the way from the back where you could feel the weight of the brush and just letting it run across the paper? So pace and pressure. So notice I'm left with pigment on my palette. What I'm going to begin to do here is I'm going to go to the next level. So if this was butter, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look for the consistency of cream. So when you think of cream, it actually moves. So I'm going to go back into my blue. I'm going to just pick up a little more pigment. I'm going to bring it into the well. And the way I could see that is when I move my palette, you could actually see that water moving. Now, cream doesn't move. When I think cream, you could also think of honey. So it does move, it does drip, but not really fast. So I could add a little more pigment, and I could see the difference already between the first and the second. I'm going to bring in just a touch more water. Now you could play it on the safe side. If it looks too much like the first one, like butter, add more water. Now, if it's really runny, if any movement makes this palette drip or run right across it, then you may have added too much. So what would you do? You add a little more pigment. So managing the ratio of water to color. There's your watercolor. So I think I have it. I'm going to grab my brush. I'm going to think of my pace. I'm going to think of pressure. And I'm going to run it from right at the top. And now I see, oh yeah, there's a nice little bead because I should have mentioned, I'm working at an angle. So I'm using a little bit of gravity, as you could see here, where you see that little bit of drip, where I could use that to my advantage. And there's something here that's called the bead right at the end. And I'm going to use that to even out each brush stroke. So what I'm looking is for a nice, perfectly even, flat wash. And now there may have been some stuff on my paper that makes these little marks there. But that's what I wanted. Now, can you see the difference between the value, the darkness between the first one and the second one? That's what we wanted. We want this one to be way darker than this one. And now we want this one to be lighter than the previous, but darker than the next. So what am I going to do? I'm going to turn my cream into milk. So obviously it's going to be runnier. What I'm doing is I'm dipping my brush just a little bit into my water and I'm bringing it over to my palette. I'm not going for more pigment. There's plenty of pigment here and it's definitely runnier. I'm going to add just a little more. Now this is it whole milk or 2% milk? That's up to you. Just add a little more pigment. And maybe a little more water. So back and forth, back and forth. And you as the artist are going to make a judgment call on, okay, am I at the right consistency? Is this the consistency and the value that I'm looking for? What value means is lightness or darkness. So here we are. One more time. I'm going to bring it right across. And immediately I could see the contrast. Now, wow, notice that because it's a lot more moisture, I don't need to dip right back into it. There's so much on my brush that I could just run it, look at that, one time, and it covers the entire square. So all I did was dip it in here once, and with that, I just covered the entire square, or rectangle. Okay, so we're gonna go from milk to coffee. So what am I gonna do? I'm gonna add more water. And now, we're thinking about coffee, and not in terms of light or dark, in terms of consistency. So think about the consistency of whole milk, or even 2% milk, and the consistency of coffee. That's what we're looking for here. So I'm adding more water, and I'm going to bring it right onto the paper. And obviously, as I add more water, the pigment is going to dilute and it's going to become a lot more transparent. Therefore, it's going to look a lot lighter. So when we play with the consistency of our pigment, we're also managing the opacity of it. Now, these two were too close for me. I want to make these jumps where you could literally see the contrast between one and the next. So for the last one, we have butter, honey or cream, milk, coffee. The last one is going to be tea. So I'm bringing a little bit of pigment from here to this one because I just noticed that these are too close. So there might have been too much pigment on my brush. And that's one of those things where you really want to, as a watercolor artist, you really need to know what is on my brush. What am I about to bring over to my paper? So notice that this really, as soon as I move it, it just runs all over. But it is a lot lighter. Less pigment, more water. So here we started at 90% pigment, 10% water. Now we are going to be at the opposite. 90% water, 10% pigment. And let's see what it looks like. Now, one thing is missing. When this dries, we're actually going to get the true color that we just painted on. Also, the quality of the paper. But there we have it. Management of consistency, and simultaneously, what we're doing is we're managing the value, the lightness or darkness of your watercolor. So there's one exercise that you cannot practice enough, because when you watercolor paint, that is what you're going to be doing over and over and over. And if you're successful, if you're feeling happy when you paint, is because this is coming together really, really well. And I showed you, it comes from, let's see, right here. It comes from your water container and your brush to your palette to your paper. So knowing what you're doing in each of those steps, getting really familiar with how much water and how this brush reacts and picks up pigment and brings in water and how it delivers it onto the paper, very important. So doing this with different brushes is also really, really important. Okay, so for the other side, what I want to do is I'm going to grab a paper towel, and this is going to be, these are going to be our best friends here. I'm going to wipe it just clean, and I always keep one right on my hand, in order to be more in control of things like this. So if I dip my brush in the water and then I bring it over to my palette, having a paper towel here to just tap and dab to control the moisture when you need to dry it a little bit, this is your best friend. This is how you're really gonna test and manage. Sometimes you could overdo it and then it's really, really dry. But you need this. And also just to clean up, to lift. So I have a clean palette now. And your choice is going to be here. Do I use the same color to test it? Or should I switch a color? I'm going to use the same color. But what we're going to do different now is this. This was management of consistency of your paint. But we did it from wet onto dry paper. What I want you to do now is, I am going to start with butter. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up some pigment, put it on my palette. Make sure my brush was really, really wet. So I don't want this to be cream. I want it to be butter. And I want to make sure I have enough. So that should be more than enough. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to completely rinse this off. So I'm going to bring my brush into my water container and clean it as much as I can. Check it on my paper towel. And there it is. No pigment on there. So now that I have a clean brush, what I'm going to do, this is very important. And you may have seen this before, if you've done it before. What I do is I'm going to dip my brush gently. I'm going to try to manage how much water is on there. And I'm going to just wet. So I'm painting water right onto this square. Now you need to angle sometimes your head into the light to see if you're actually putting water on your paper. And to make sure you're covering the entire rectangle here. So it's a good thing I'm using that flat brush, because I go right to the edge and I just follow the line and I could see that this is wet. Now this is the next step in watercolor that I believe is absolutely fundamental for you to be successful with your paintings. And that is, you just saw me apply a little bit of water. The timing of it. How much water did I put there? Is it dripping off my paper? No. It was just enough to create a very, very thin slice, a little coat of water. I could always apply a little more. And like I said, I want to be right in that rectangle so I could see how much. So there's levels of wetness. There's very wet, where it's dripping. There's wet. Then there's moist. If you know the difference between wet and moist, that's a big deal. If you know the difference between moist and damp, also very important. And then from damp, it goes to dry. So what I want to do is I want to, when this is moist and before it's damp, I want to bring in my butter. And I'm just going to dab it on. So notice that because there's water on the paper, it's not going to be as dark. And I can go directly into the pigment and just dab it on. But there's something happening here that is different than the previous. The pigment, as soon as it touches the paper, it begins to kind of disperse. It does there's a little movement, and also there's a little bit of it's called granulation. It disperses, the pigment settles into the paper. So this is the wet on wet technique. And to me, it is my absolute favorite technique to work watercolors with. So we're going to do the same thing on this side, only difference, we did wet on dry. Here we're going to do wet on wet. So what do? I'm going to set up my paint first. I'm going to add a little more pigment. Touch a little water, bring it over. And I want to make sure I have my cream ready. And why am I doing this before? Because the timing from the moment I wet my paper, so I'm cleaning my brush now that I have my watercolor consistency ready. Because if I were to wet my paper, as I am doing now, so I'm adding a little more water. Ooh, there's a little bit of drip there, see? So that might have been a little too much. What do? You have your paper towel, dab it, and then actually with the dryer brush, instead of wetting, you're actually drying. You're picking up moisture. And you can do it a lot. And then the brush will actually dry the paper. So that's actually beyond damp, it's dry. So let me add a little bit more. So again, I'm thinking about pace, I'm thinking about pressure, even when I'm adding water. So if I were to add water, like I am right now, and then I go mix my paint and try to get my consistency, the timing could be off. It's always best to have it ready, wet, when you're ready to just bring it over. Make sure we have it, and then just touch it on. And here you could play. You could just touch it and see how the wetness of the water you apply to the paper can actually create patterns and lightness. And really trying to manage value or the consistency in this wet on wet technique, it is a little bit harder, because how do you account for the water that you laid on the paper, knowing that it's going to make it lighter when you bring lighter paint? So I'm going to make this a little bit lighter. And now we're going for milk. So I think we're there. Have it ready. Bringing water. And now I'm bringing over the pigment. So just in the touching of it onto the paper, you could see what this watercolor technique can do for you. And again, I'm using a little bit of gravity, but I can see already the difference between the first and second stroke. Maybe this one was a little too light. Could have gone a little heavier with pigment. One of the things about wet on wet is you touch it and you leave it alone. If you touch it over and over and over, you kind of ruin what the pigment is doing, which is settling down into the paper as the water dries. And it's sometimes really hard to just don't touch it. The urge to want to rebrush it and move it and rearrange it, you could lose things that you cannot make happen again, because they happen. That's the trick, the mastery of watercolor. Doing things that you can do over and over and over, exactly like you want to. I'm one of those that loves a little more the element of surprise. What watercolor can do for, ooh, look at that thing that it did right here. For example, all these things here. Oh, wow. How did that happen? I want to figure it out. Most likely I put my fingers on the paper, and that's what's showing through, like a little bit of the oil of your fingers reacting to the water. Okay, so next one, we're going for coffee. So I'm rinsing my brush, bringing a little bit of water. And this technique, wet on wet, it really takes a lot of experimenting. But no matter your level of expertise, there is always something new to learn about this technique. Here's my coffee, and I'm going to go ahead and just touch it on really quick, letting that water pick it up, move it around. Now notice that these got a lot lighter than these. So that is also the difference on why we would use one technique or the other. And this one, some of you may say, well, that one looks so light. When watercolor dries, it dries about 30% lighter than how you applied it. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'm going to just add the last bit of water here, lots of it, to get that tea. Bring in the water. So this is just the simplest way of practicing the wet on wet technique while focusing on the level of consistency and the value of your paint. Okay, this one really dripped nicely, and it got really light, even lighter than the previous. So just adding a dab more up here. And if it's dripping too much, then you bring paper towel, dab that brush, and then just run it very carefully right at the edge. And you see how the brush picks up that last little bubble, the little water bead that is dripping down. And there we have it. So this is, as I said, one of the exercises that you should really experiment with. And you don't have to do it this way. You could test it in many creative ways that you see working for you. I do highly recommend going through every single step like you see here, and with all types of different colors. Not every single color, but the colors you tend to use the most. Color mixes actually applies really well. So if you're using reds and yellows that you mix into oranges, to do this and try to manage the value and the consistency of those colors that you use frequently. If you do it with both techniques, then you're getting a better sense, a better reference for how you should use those and how you could actually tone it down, push it higher, meaning a little bit deeper in terms of opacity, or less water. Also, different brushes. So, we're going to move to the exercise number 2. And for this one, I'm going to use the opposite page. And this is obviously drying. So I'm going to go ahead and move this just a little bit out of the way. But the next exercise we're going to do is this one. We're going to take one color. In this case, I'm going to use probably the same. And what we're going to do is, just like we're doing here, we're going to take it from dark to light, and then on the opposite side, from light to dark. How are we going to do that? And I'll show you a different sample here where I did my 3 primaries, where you take yellow and you can actually see all the different values that you could use in your paintings. So knowing how to get here, this, most importantly, right about here with this color is where you get beautiful watercolors. Here, all the way up to here. And with blue, this is the beautiful part right here. So discover, and you can have all sorts of these and layer them, but these areas of value is what you want to discover with those colors. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take, again, you could mask. Now these exercises, the samples that I showed you, I did not use masking tape. I used it on the edges, but I just ran the brush across. And what I did was this. So I'm going to use the same color. And this time I'm going to use the brush that I recommended. And I'm just going to start right over here. So what I do is this. I'm going to start really, really dark. And when I say dark, in terms of value, I mean consistency-wise, I want, once again, butter. And if you find something thicker than butter, it probably is coming right out of the tube. So there it is. There's my thickest one. There's my stickiest consistency here. And I'm just going to go ahead and run it right across. Now this brush delivers water too. So you got to be careful, because if you're squeezing water as you're doing this, you may not control it as well. But what am I going to do here? I'm going to just, whether I'm using this brush and just add a little bit of, by squeezing 1 drop of water, and I want to show you if you could see it here on camera. 1 drop of water into the entire mix. Boop, there it was. Or you could just dip your brush into your water container and bring it over, mix in the entire puddle of pigment that you have here. Now, it may be too much and it's going to run you all the way down. You want to see the change from one stroke to the next. And how do I do that? That's the key. How do I get from one value to the next where I can control the consistency and the opacity, or the value of the color that I want? So sometimes this may be way too much for me for the remainder of the exercise. I might as well bring it over to this side. How much? About that much. And I'm bringing just a drop of water and mixing it to see if there's at least one visible change between the previous and this next line. And I'm beginning to see it. So once again, bringing another drop of water, and I'm doing 1 drop of water at a time. You could do 2 drops of water, but the way you measure how much water you're bringing over into this mix and being able to see, I could definitely see how there's a big jump there from the last one to this one. There, it was when I brought this over. And I could always bring in a little more pigment, but that's when you get a little bit trickier, because you don't want to go backwards. You don't want to get darker. You don't want to get more consistency. So the way I'm doing it now is just for the purposes of this exercise. But the way you would do it generally is you're adding either more water or more pigment, and you're making a decision on, yep, that's where I want it. Now notice how I'm going way lighter. I'm going just about halfway through the value scale, bringing more water. And you begin to see how, okay, it's getting a lot lighter. And it did so very quickly. So that happened when I changed from one puddle to the next. Otherwise, we would have been this opaque for a few extra lines until the ratio of water to pigment becomes a little more water than pigment. And you begin to feel it. This becomes really just completely intuitive. And as an artist, your decision is then, well, I need to know what value I need to be working with, and we're going to explore that in the next exercise. Notice that I'm adding 1 and just a little bit more than 1 drop of water to every subsequent line here. And I'm making them also a little bit thicker. just to give a little visual. So as they get lighter, they get thicker. Now, what I do want to be adding, I should have mentioned this too, is when I add water, I want to make sure I'm adding clean water to my mix here. Because if you have a container where it's getting a little murky and darker than the actual pigment, no matter how much water you add to your pigment, it doesn't get lighter. That's because the water's pigmented. So you want to make sure you have clean water when you're bringing it in. And notice that I'm mixing the entire puddle. So every line from one to the next, you could actually see there's a difference in the ratio between water and pigment. And can you see it here? Actually, it's coming along really nice. How it's accidentally getting thicker. Adding more water. And I did mention the ingredient of patience. Now, even if you are a fast, loose watercolor painter, you do want to maintain a level of patience. And what I mean by that is not, oh, you got to be super slow, super accurate and effective. And no, it's just the measurements, the patience it takes for you to consider what you're doing with the water and the pigment and how you're about to apply it to the paper. That's all. Now, there will be a moment where you feel where you're just painting with water. Now, that's going to happen eventually as I continue adding more and more water. All of the pigment will be gone. And the other thing we're doing here is, in a way, you're looking at strategies, because you need to develop your own strategies for mixing and controlling. See, now I'm going to have to add a lot of water here for you to see any difference in the next couple of lines. Or you could do what I did early on, which is bring some of this over to here, and as you add more water, then you're going to see a drastic change. And actually, I added almost double, triple the water I've been adding. So this next one, we're at the level where, yep, this is extremely transparent. The next, how many more steps do you think I could squeeze in until it's just water? I'm going to add 3 more. Adding 3 more drops of water here. And this is going to be my final one. And yeah, it almost barely sees pigment move. It's, when it dries, it may register very, very lightly. Just as a very, kind of like a ghost stain there. And we'll see how that works. So there it is. So we went all the way from thickest consistency and took it all the way down. And we could keep going. We could keep going until we're just bringing clean water over to the paper. I'm wiping down my palette because what I'm going to do next is a quick exercise. We'll try to make this one a little bit quicker. And I'm going to probably not finish it all the way through because I want you to do it in order to see that there's alternatives. So this time, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to add some water to my palette. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to tap just a tiny bit of pigment, the minimum. And what I want to do is work opposite. So I'm going to add water here first, and I added just a little bit of pigment to this puddle of water. So I want to add a lot more water to start off with, because I'm going to be picking up, and now you can see it. And what I want to do is work opposite. So is it easier to control from really thick to watered down, or can I do it from really watered down? Oh my gosh, that is extremely light. So I'm just adding more so you could see it. Can you see it? There it is. And what do I do next? So I begin to control how much pigment I tap in. So I could do that, bringing it over to here, and then from here to the puddle, just so I don't go too far too fast. Because how you manage darkening the values, it most likely will be the way you watercolor paint. And you notice that we have this, we go to the pigment, and little by little we'll lose water, and the more pigment we add, we'll end up with just butter. You could already begin to see the transition as I've added 3 little dabs of pigment into this puddle of water. So how you do that, it is your very own unique way of watercoloring. And that is what you're here for, to learn how to do it your way. There's very general rules, the ones I'm showing you right now. You know, wet on dry, wet on wet, consistency. But you make every single decision all the way from beginning to end. And you may switch up, alter some of those, and make it easier. Figure out a way that works exactly the way you would want it. And for me, this is a little tougher. And again, it's because we're working with the pattern of, well, it's supposed to get darker little by little. But most paintings, you don't deal with value this way. So at least knowing what you can do and how you would do it, knowing that you can do it and there is a way to do it, I think opens up not just one, but so many doors. And you can see how it's already working. Now, is there a different feel? Does it feel different? Adding water to the pigment or adding pigment to the water? Which one feels better for you? Which one feels more natural? Which one gives you the look of watercolor that makes you smile? I'm beginning to dip just a little more pigment like we did with water, so you could begin to see how immediately we reach the ratio where it's that beautiful, rich watercolor look. And I'm being very patient here. Oops, there we go, one more. Being a little bit patient, a little bit extra patient. Because what I want to be paying attention is how it feels. How it feels to mix the pigment into the water. How I choose to tap the pigment or rub it, or how I choose to bring it over, and what am I looking at? What am I seeing as I try to make the next, or create the next value? What are the things that stand out? Is there something that just feels way too awkward or weird? Nope, this is not working for me. It's a good thing to have, because it's a question that you need to answer. once you have the question, you're more than halfway there. Like Einstein said, hardest thing is coming up with the question. And that's good. So things that don't seem right, all you do is think about it, test it, experiment, and then figure it out. And what begins to feel right, that's a good clue. And there we have it. So I could keep going. Now this brush is a little too small for this type of brush stroke here, the area that I'm trying to fill up. So you'll see that it's not as smooth as the previous lines or rectangles. But it goes all the way to more and more opaque until I just go for 100% butter. Now let's see how opaque I can make this. And just bringing it over. And you could also do this wet on wet. And it's a great exercise for you to discover, most importantly, your strategy. How do I mix water and color to make sure I capture values and bring them over to the paper? So it's looking beautiful. And it is a great exercise. A great exercise that you can make really fun. And as I said, having a sketchbook where you can actually test these things out and then look back as a reference and just follow through. And we'll be going through some of these throughout this series. A lot of these exercises, how to chart your colors, how to test all different techniques, how to do color mixing, color wheels, all these different things. How you organize it, having it in a sketchbook, it's a great tool. We're going to do one final exercise, and we're going to try to do that very quick. I'm going to go over to the next page, and hopefully this dried a little. And right here, what I want you to do is this. I want you to grab a pencil, and I want you to draw alongside with me. So you're going to, not in the middle, a little bit, let's say 2/3. Or no, let's see. Actually, you know what? You could put it in the middle. So I'm going to go middle. And I'm just going to draw a vertical line about that big. And I'm actually going to draw a cube. So I'm going to pick a line. Now notice that this line, if I were to put my ruler straight across, it's not a horizontal line. It's actually a little bit off, let's say about 30 degrees this way. Did you see that? So instead of being a horizontal line, it's about 30 degrees upwards in this direction. So if you were looking at a clock, it's not 12 o'clock, it's not 9 o'clock, it's about 10 o'clock. And that line, I'm going to try to match it. So think about this line, and what I want you to do is parallel to that line. I'm going to connect it to the bottom right there. Then I'm going to take this line and I'm just going to bring it over here, and same thing, parallel, connecting the other two edges. Now, just like we did on this side, where we went to 10 o'clock. Here, we're not going to go to 3 o'clock. We're not going to go to 12 o'clock. We're going to go to 2 o'clock. So right about here. You see how I did that? So again, if I did a straight line, that would be 3 o'clock. Go to 2 o'clock. And then, same thing. This line, we make it parallel down here. And then I'm going to connect those two right there. Now we have this line right here in this direction. We need to make it parallel here. So I could just literally ghost over it and bring it over to the back. And if I have that parallel to this, it should look perfect. So the final one, this one, should be parallel to this one. And all I say parallel, we're looking at the angle of that line. That's it. So we have a cube. Now, your job is to pick one color. And hopefully we have enough time. Let's see if yeah, we should. You're going to select from what we saw earlier. So we saw wet on dry. That means we brought a wet brush, even with butter, on dry paper. Or we wet the paper and then we brought wet pigment on the wet paper, which is wet on wet. So wet on dry, wet on wet. Your choice is going to be one of those two. Your choice is going to be pick a color. I'm going to use the same color once again. And I want you to kind of follow with me. So we have 1, 2, 3 sides. No matter which one you pick, I want you to make one of these dark butter. I want you to make one of them milk. And I want you to make the other one tea. So 3 different consistencies where you could really, really see one that's super dark, one that's right in the middle, one that's ultra light. And however you make that, it's up to you. So the other thing is, are you going to do that wet on wet or wet on dry? So I'm going to make this side right here my darkest. And I'm going to make it butter. So I'm just going to go ahead, wet on dry, and paint that right in. Now it's a little bit, just a little bit closer to cream. It's not really, it's melting butter, let's call it that. And once again, you're also practicing your brushing skills. How do you rub direction-wise, pace-wise, and speed-wise to have a nice, even... See right here, I missed this one. And what happens when I have a little dot like that on my paper? Well, you could risk it and touch it over, but then everything, as I mentioned, everything changes because what you had there is no more. So you always run the risk. So my philosophy is touch it, leave it alone. That's the beauty of watercolor. You put it on, leave it alone. So, my next one, and I should mention, you got to be very careful when you touch these edges because if they're not dry, they're going to go wherever there's water on the paper. The reason it stops right here at that hard edge is because that's the end of it. No water anywhere. As soon as I add water, water is going to try to flow towards water. So, when I come over, and I add my second, which I'm going to place right over here. Consistency. I want to be careful when I get close to that edge because they will, the term is bleed into each other. So leave a little tiny space between them. Just like I did there. And as it gets dry, then you're fine. Moist, it will bleed. The wetter it is, the more it will bleed. Once you get to damp, you may have a little bleeding, but it won't be devastating. Sometimes you do want it. So intentionally, you will set it up. Now finally, I'm adding one more and just bring in an ultra light. in order to get my lightest consistency. And that will be T, right up here. Now this one's really wet, obviously, because it's low consistency, meaning pigment-wise. So I really, really want to keep those edges away from each other. On this side, we might be okay. Now you will see things where if we have pigment that's drying and you add more water to it, water will push that pigment. So you have what's called the cauliflower effect, where water just pushes the pigment and then creates these shapes on the paper. That sometimes can drive you crazy. Sometimes they look beautiful and amazing. So just like that, with 3 quick values, look how amazing you can create the illusion of 3-dimensionality. Now, one thing that I wanted to touch on, but gonna probably save it for next week, is now that we have this, and this is dry, next week we're gonna look at not just wet on dry, but you could do this wet on wet, how to layer. What do you mean layer? Yeah, I have one layer. I could actually come with the same consistency. And this is the same puddle that I had laid down earlier on this same square. But when I double it, meaning I layer it on top of itself, it automatically becomes twice as dark. So your bind might have just gone, oh, wow. So that whole thing we did, we could have just done it in layers. And that's what we do. We just apply layers. And I'm going to just cast a shadow. So if my light is coming from here, my shadow, most likely it's going to go this way. Like that. And that means I could really layer this in, make it extremely dark. And now we're getting into how we deal with light. And I guess the final thing we can do here is just place this on a surface. Give it a little horizon line there and here. And there we go. Now, one thing that you may want to do, which is what I mentioned just a second ago, is if you have extra paper, you could actually just play with, like I'm going to do here. You could just, with a flat brush, create a nice square. And you can actually create cubes by just kind of dabbing the brush on, letting it dry, and then layering over one of those sides. So this has to be fully dry before you come over it again and apply the second layer. And then you'll bring up, obviously the consistency will be thicker, darker. The value will also be lowered. And there we have it. Watercolor Basics, Session 1. So I hope you guys enjoyed it.